when listening to a teaching that has as its aim the exposing of the false identity, or the bringing of the false identity to a final end, it's very important to pay close attention to how one is listening. Usually what happens when people listen to a teaching that has as its purpose to bring the false identity to a final end, or to expose the false identity, usually what people do is they project some thought onto what they're hearing. They interpret what they're hearing. And therefore, they're not actually hearing what is being said at all. Because they've changed it, they have distorted what they have heard through thinking. And so they think they have heard what has been said, but what they have really heard is their own thoughts. There may be a small number of spiritual teachings that would encourage one to interject their own thoughts. In the idea of find your own truth or something like that. But almost always what ends up happening is those thoughts are actually the ego's truth, which is not truth at all. And so, in order to hear what's being said in this particular kind of teaching, this type of teaching, which is the teaching to bring the ego to its final end, and to expose the ego, and by ego in this case meaning the false identity, it is very important to watch what are you doing with thoughts, what are you doing with thinking, what are you doing with ideas, beliefs, what's happening with the movement of thought while you're listening. One way to avoid any sort of interpretation of what's being heard is to, as much as possible, use the literal definition of the words, the dictionary meaning of the words. Now, there's a very important exception to that rule, and that is if a particular spiritual teaching defined certain words in certain ways, then of course, in that case, it's important to use how that particular spiritual teaching uses those words. For example, in this teaching, in the teachings, for example, that are found in the books, The Most Direct Means to Eternal Bliss, and also the book, The 7 Steps to Awakening, the ego, definition of ego there is different from the dictionary definition, or from how many spiritual teachings would define it. And at some point, it's important to go into that. But for now, we're talking about listening. Because what's the point of thinking one is listening to a teaching about exposing or ending the ego, bringing the ego to its final end, if one isn't really listening? So it's important to actually get this point about listening. So back to the interpretation. To stop interpreting, if one just takes the literal meaning or how words are defined within a particular spiritual teaching, but not project one's own interpretation of the meaning, that is one part of how to listen. But there is much more to how to listen, because human beings have been missing teachings for as long as there have been teachings in human beings. Through ego's tricks, interpretation is one of them. So there's a lot more, so much more, to how to listen to this type of spiritual teaching. One of the ways one fails to receive a spiritual teaching like this is forgetfulness. One forgets what was said, and when one forgets what was said, people almost always fill in the blanks with some fantasy about what was said. There is a game or an illustration. I think sometimes it's been called telephone, but that doesn't really matter. There's an illustration here. The illustration is, let us suppose that you have 20 people, and one person tells something to another person, a story or something like that, and rather lengthy, with quite a bit of details that take some time to tell. Maybe it's a long story, maybe it's a 10-minute story or a 30-minute story or something like that. So the point of this is that one person tells another person. Then that second person tells a third person the story. And it goes on and on and on. And by the time you get to the 20th person, the story isn't even recognizable. Because even if the people tried to get it right, they don't remember it correctly. But it isn't just not remembering it correctly. This is an important point. Thought comes in and changes what was said. That's why the 20th person has a completely different story now, because a little changed through each person. But even without the 20-person story, just two people, a speaker and a listener, just those two. In the case of spiritual teachings, which are directed towards exposing the ego and bringing the ego to its final end, there is so much motivation by the ego to want to distort that it doesn't take 20 people. Just the speaker to the listener, and the listener distorts and distorts and distorts and distorts. And so many ways not to receive the spiritual teaching. There are so many ways. So one of the things that was mentioned was forgetfulness. And of course there's the failure to apply what's being heard. How many of you applied the forgetfulness lesson to what's been said so far? In other words, even what's been said so far can involve forgetfulness, where one doesn't know what was the first example of how one distorts and what the solution was offered. A solution was offered. So repetition has a tremendous value. But repetition in these teachings has a tremendous value for many reasons. There are many reasons why repetition has a great value. And one of them is that the ego is trying to block everything that is being said. And repetition solves, or helps to solve many of these problems. And so one of the problems that repetition helps to solve is this problem of memory, of not remembering what one has heard. Because in order to be able to put it into practice in one's life, to actually apply a teaching, rather than simply leave a teaching to be some intellectual thing that one just plays around with, but to actually put it into practice, it helps to remember a teaching, and repetition helps that. Now, another way to achieve repetition is simply to read or hear the same teaching many, many times over. Now, these are keys being conveyed as to why almost every human being on earth misses any teaching, which is aimed at exposing the ego and bringing the ego to its final end. Because not missing the teaching means that one puts it into practice, and eventually the ego actually comes to a final end. That's what it means if one did not miss the teaching. Otherwise, one misses it. So, in repetition, one way of viewing repetition would be to say if the teacher is repeating something several times within a short span of time, that's one kind of repetition. But another kind of repetition is just if the one who is studying a teaching will listen to or read the same teaching over and over and over. In other words, instead of going on to some new concept, without ever having really received the first teaching, if one stays on the first teaching and just listens to it so many times that it's actually sunk in, it's not only because of memory, it's because of penetrating all of the layers of the false self's resistance. There are thousands and thousands of layers of self-deception, human self-deception. Now, to be able to penetrate all those layers, repetition can help. So to stay on the first teaching and listen to that first teaching over and over, you might listen to it 100 times, or if you're reading it, you might read the same teaching 100 times, so that, in other words, just to really get one point before going on to some other point, some other teaching, just to get one teaching, to actually receive one teaching. The question of being bored with a teaching, it's very important to bring that point in right here at this point now. Repetition might seem boring to someone, and it may be more entertaining or pleasurable or enjoyable to go on to the next concept. Something new, something interesting, not the same old thing 100 times over. And that's what almost every human being without exception does. There are so few people who don't just go right on to the next concept, but right on to the next teaching, to where it becomes a collection of concepts, to where it becomes spiritual entertainment. And yeah, it is probably more entertaining, more pleasurable to go from one teaching to the next teaching, to the next concept, because it's something that seems new and interesting. But it misses the whole point entirely. The entire point is missed by doing that. So this becomes a question of how interested in awakening are you? How interested in bringing the ego to its final end are you? How much does eternal freedom matter to you? When the ego comes to its final end, all suffering, all sorrow come to a final end. And what remains can be described as infinite, eternal awareness, love, bliss. Those words are not describing separate things or parts of something. That eternal awareness is love. It isn't that there is the love and the awareness, not two. Infinite love is a way of describing that awareness. Infinite joy is a way of describing that awareness. But the love and the awareness and the joy are not three different things. And they're not parts, because this doesn't have parts. It's just one awareness. And it really is worth dedicating every moment of your life towards that awakening. So, one of the most important factors in determining if one is going to be one of those extremely rare humans that succeeds in bringing the ego to its final end is how intense is one's desire for freedom, for truth, for eternal life. Because what remains is eternal life. That's what that eternal awareness is. It is alive. It has always been alive. It is a living reality. It is the only reality, and the only thing that is truly alive. And that love, how important is it to you? And how many lies will the ego tell to itself in answer to that question? So whatever one can do to increase the extremely intense desire for this freedom one should do. So how intense one's desire for freedom is very important in this. If the desire for freedom increases even a little, it helps. But it has to actually have increased. It can't be the ego lying to itself, the false identity lying to itself and saying that it has increased when it hasn't. So even a little increase helps. However, it's important to go from a little increase to a great increase in the desire for freedom, for truth, the desire to bring the ego to its final end, the desire to remain in the direct experience of infinite love, but not the concept of infinite love. Not the concept of infinite love. Really important point. Not the concept of infinite love. The direct experience which is infinite itself. Which is infinite itself. The experience is infinite. Human beings always want to make such a trivial affair of things. If something happens and you have a little more love and joy in your life, that is a good thing. But that has nothing to do with infinite love. It's not a trivial thing like that. It's not a trivial affair. So the direct experience of infinite love, the direct experience, how important is it to you? How much do you want that? To increase the extremely intense desire for that freedom. It is so important. So increasing it a little is helpful, definitely is helpful. But you need to go beyond that and increase it a lot. So you double your present level and all sorts of wonderful benefits come. And one of the benefits is the ability to see the ego's tricks clearly. Not just talk about the ego's tricks. That's even a good first step. Some people can't even talk about them, wouldn't even want to hear the idea that there are thousands of layers of self-deception. So that's a good first step. But the ability to say that there are thousands of layers of self-deception doesn't mean that one is actually seeing those thousands of layers of self-deception in one. If one can increase the extremely intense desire for freedom, and just to be clear, that means to increase the extremely intense desire to bring the ego to its final end, and thus to remain in the direct experience of infinite eternal love, which is different from the concept's infinite eternal love. If one increases that desire, then one can see the ego's tricks. And even a little increase helps some to see that. To see the ego's defense mechanisms, the false selves, false identities, defense mechanisms. It helps one to see them. And that's a great beginning. And greater self-honesty comes. Now, if one goes beyond simply increasing the desire for freedom, which is the same as saying the desire for awakening, if one can go beyond a little increase in that to a great increase, like, for example, not just doubling one's present level, but multiplying it times 10, then times 100. This is just to indicate a great increase, that's all. Trying to indicate a great increase. Then self-honesty also increases. And the ability to see not just some, but then eventually all of those thousands of layers of self-deception. In other words, every time the ego is playing a trick, which means thought, thinking, especially thinking. Every time thought, concepts, ideas, beliefs, opinions are being used in a way that is actually perpetuating the false identity, how it's fooling itself, how it's to be able to see that clearly requires a tremendous increase in the desire for liberation. And if one can increase it to a truly profound level, one can see all those layers. If one takes it further, like, for example, if one's desire for freedom becomes as great as the energy of the sun, then with that kind of extremely intense desire for freedom, what comes is a level of self-honesty previously unknown, and a level of clarity. And in that clarity, instead of simply seeing all those layers of self-deception, most of them can come to an end. So that finally, one is not engaging in self-deception. So that there is very, very little self-deception going on. If one can take it further, so that one's desire for freedom, for awakening, for bringing the ego to its final end, for remaining eternally in the direct experience of infinite love and perfect joy, if one's desire for that can go from the energy of one star to the energy of 1 trillion stars, then one can stop ego deception, self-deception entirely. One can stop the tricks. And if one's desire for freedom is the same as the energy, has the same amount of intensity as the energy of 1 trillion stars, then one's clarity and self-honesty also is on that same intense level of energy. It has that, one's self-honesty then has the intensity of 1 trillion stars. Then one's clarity has the intensity of 1 trillion stars. But, of course, of all the many lies that one might tell one's imaginary self, one must not lie to oneself and say that one has reached that level of having that intensity of 1 trillion stars if one hasn't. All along the way, rather one just has almost no desire for freedom at all, to having a little. Honesty. Honesty is the key. So, the ability to actually see these thousands of layers of self-deception, or just one at a time, throughout the day, from the time one wakes up until the time one goes to sleep, to be able to see, to catch an ego lie, to catch the false self's lies, which means to watch one's thinking and ask about these thoughts, each thought. How is this perpetuating the ego? And when the mind says, oh, it's not perpetuating the ego, this thought, just assume that it is. Just assume that is another lie. That's where these layers come in. A lie behind a lie behind a lie behind another 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 lie. And then another lie masquerading as truth and another lie masquerading as truth. So when the ego says, no, this thought isn't actually perpetuating the ego illusion, this isn't actually for the purpose, just assume that it is and say, no, I'm rejecting that. I'm asking again and 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 again I'm asking. How is this thought a creation of the false identity for the purpose of preserving the false identity? And then ask it again. And keep asking those questions about thought. Keep looking at thought. Seeing how thought is perpetuating the false identity. See what lies the false identity is telling to itself. Now, and so increasing the desire for freedom is the key. It's the key to everything. It's the number one key. Right along with that key is self-honesty. However, they're dependent on each other in the sense that there's very little self-honesty without the extremely intense desire for freedom. And on the other hand, in order to arrive at a greater desire for freedom, some self-honesty is required. So they're sort of dependent on each other. So now to return to the point of listening. The greater one's desire for freedom, authentically, not the ego lying to itself saying it has a great desire for freedom when in fact it doesn't, but the actual increase in the desire for freedom helps one to listen, because the willingness to actually stop the ego's distorting what one is hearing then occurs. So now, having given a little of some of the essentials that surround listening, let's review again the first point that was made, which is watch your thoughts to see what your thoughts are doing, and just try and keep those thoughts out of it as much as possible while listening. Because almost every thought that comes is going to simply be a block to the listening. It is almost every thought that comes is going to be an ego preservation strategy, an attempt by the ego to block block hearing, block receiving, block getting the value out of the teaching. So take the literal meaning, or if the particular spiritual teaching defines a particular word in a particular way, then use that. But don't add your own ideas or meanings, and don't look for any hidden meanings, because in this particular teaching there are no hidden meanings. There's no code, there's no secret code or anything like that. So if you look for a hidden meaning, what you're going to do is, what will happen is that the ego will come in, and then it will then interpret, and then it will change and distort the teaching into something else, and that's a way of not receiving it. The extremely intense desire for freedom solves everything. But to solve everything, it has to truly be extremely intense, and it has to be maintained. And an example of how it changes everything is one for the first time, in looking at all the thousands of possible spiritual teachings, for the first time, if the extremely intense desire for freedom is there, for the first time one can see which spiritual teachings are leading to the ego's final end and which are not. Of course, without the extremely intense desire for freedom, the ego would like to continue, and it selects spiritual teachings that will help it to continue. There are spiritual teachings that were created by the ego for the purpose of perpetuating the ego. There are spiritual teachings that were created by purity in the beginning, that over time so many additions were added by the ego that the teaching was changed into a teaching that will now perpetuate the ego. And there are teachings that have as their aim the final end of the ego, that have not yet been distorted by the ego. But even then, if one were to find one of those types of teachings, back to this point about listening, the ego can take a pure teaching that is designed, that is intended, that was created for the purpose of bringing the ego to its final end, and immediately interpret it in a way that will simply perpetuate the ego. That's why self-honesty is so important, to catch the ego's tricks, and that's why increasing the desire for freedom is so important. Regarding this point about dictionary definitions, there can be a spiritual meaning that is different from the dictionary definition, that a spiritual teaching may not have clearly defined. And it's okay to look at that, but one has to be so very, very careful that it is not just a thought interpretation. It's an area where almost always when a human being does that, what they do is really just simply they distort the teaching. But there are times when there is a meaning of a word that is not the dictionary meaning, and that the spiritual teaching might not have defined clearly. And therefore, it's important simply to be reading in context of what you're reading. It has this meaning, obviously, in the context of what you're reading. But don't supply your own context. Take a look at the teaching that you're reading or listening to, and make sure that it is in the context, that the meaning you're giving it really does come from what you're hearing. Here's one way to do it. You ask yourself, is that what was really said? Or is that some meaning, something that I've imagined onto it? It's so common for someone to say something and another person to say what they think they just heard and have it just be something totally, completely different without the person being aware that they've just projected a meaning. Now, sometimes a person's fantasy, they like their fantasy. Even though it's not the teaching, they like it. And sometimes they have a fantasy about what they heard or read, and they don't like it. It's an interesting experience to present a teaching and whether it be in written or spoken form, but to present a teaching, have a person fantasize about what they just heard, and then criticize the teaching based on that fantasy, which is a criticism of their fantasies, since what they thought they heard wasn't actually what was presented at all. So the solution to all this is to increase the extremely intense desire for freedom and to bring self-honesty into play, which the extremely intense desire for freedom will bring self-honesty into play, to watch thoughts and ask, have I added any thought to what was said? Have I changed what was said in any way? Or have I added any thoughts to what I'm reading? Have I changed what I'm reading in any way? So that is a foundation in listening. To begin with a foundation in listening. Going back to this point, about getting the first lesson before going on to the next, getting the first teachings, getting one teaching before going on to the next teaching. The greater one's desire for freedom, the more important it is to one to get the first teaching, which means to have fully received the first teaching, which means to have it penetrated to where it is now a part of one's life, one is putting it into practice and one isn't forgetting it, to have gotten all of that before going on to the next. The greater one's desire for freedom, the more important it is to get the first lesson before going on to the next. The repetition that a teaching may have, or a written teaching or a teaching one is hearing, that may have, is nothing compared to the repetition that the serious seeker of freedom is going to create. Because that one in whom the extremely intense desire for freedom has arisen insists upon getting the first lesson before going on to the next. Because they know that going on to the next is just playing with concepts and collecting concepts, which is entertaining, but which is a lie. It is an ego lie. It is an ego preservation strategy, which incidentally taking the teaching, intellectual, making a concept out of it, playing with ideas, collecting ideas, is one idea after the other. Collecting ideas in the sense of one idea after the other, going on to the next lesson and the next teaching and the next idea, before ever getting the first one, before getting it to the point where it's totally sunk in. And that making teachings into something intellectual is something that most people do throughout their lives. You very rarely meet an exception to this. It doesn't mean they realize that they're doing it. They may not think that they're making it into something intellectual, but people go on discussing and thinking about spiritual teachings and just playing with concepts, and before they know it, 10 years is gone, 20 years is gone, 30 years is gone, 40 years is gone, 50 years is gone, 60 years is gone, and they're still just playing with concepts. Because the foundation was never there to do something other than play with concepts. There's a foundation that is needed, and the foundation is the extremely intense desire for freedom and the self-honesty that it brings. and the clarity that it brings. So, to get the first lesson first, before going on to the next. So the student will create more repetition. The student, the seeker of freedom who has an extremely intense desire for freedom, they will create far more repetition than the teacher did. All right, the teacher repeated a few things the same time in order to help get it down. But the student might listen to it, the same teaching 100 times before going on to the next teaching. Just to give you an example, it doesn't mean it has to be exactly 100 times. This is to illustrate a point to you. And therefore, the student has created far more repetition than the teacher. The teacher just repeated things a few times, but the student has turned that into having things repeated hundreds of times. So the serious student will create far more repetition than the teacher. So here is another valuable key. And incidentally, this talk it's been filled with extraordinarily valuable keys, which that doesn't mean that the listener will have any idea that there were any valuable keys here. That really depends on the listener. The ego can block anything out. The ego can decide there wasn't a single valuable key here, but there were many greatly valuable keys about how to listen, but about so many other things, which is what does it take? What does it take to be one of those very rare human beings who actually succeeds in bringing the ego to its final end? And that means it can never come back again. If it's truly the final end, the key word is final. That word, final, if it has come to its final end, it can never come back again. It's gone. And to be actually able to succeed in that, which means all sorrow is gone forever, all suffering is gone forever. What remains is a state of absolute perfection. What remains is absolute perfection for all of eternity, because infinite love is absolutely perfect and has been for all of eternity. And infinite awareness is perfect and has been for all of eternity. Perfect in the sense that there can't be anything that is more sacred, more complete, more whole, because it's absolutely complete. Absolute fulfillment, nothing lacking. A state of perfect joy, not a joy that's mixed with something, not a joy or a love that gets mixed with anything else. A joy, an infinite joy and love that only knows infinite joy and love. But not as a concept, not the concept of infinite love. Not what a human imagines infinite love to be, from some little tiny finite human perspective that goes throughout its whole imaginary existence knowing only the finite. The infinite is not like the human experience. In the infinite, there has never been anything like the human experience in all of eternity, not even for 1 second. Nothing as trivial as a planet or a star has ever arisen in the infinite in all of eternity, because a planet and a star is part of the dream, part of the illusion. What remains when the ego comes to its final end is infinite love that only knows infinite love. Infinite perfect joy that only knows infinite perfect joy. And that direct experience of the final end of the ego, of the final end of all sorrow, all suffering, that eternal experience of perfect infinite love, of eternal life, that is worth devoting every moment of your life to, from the time you wake up in the morning to the time you go to sleep. And when you do that, incidentally, even when you go to sleep, that's going to continue automatically. But for every moment, from the time you wake up to the time you go to sleep, to dedicate every moment of your life to bringing the ego to its final end is worth it. That infinite love is worth it. The end of all sorrow and suffering really is worth it. But the ego tells almost everyone it isn't worth it. There's some other thing I want to do. I'm this, that, and the other thing. The ego, one of the thousands and thousands of ego preservation strategies is how one uses one's time, wasting time that could have been used. Oh, and one of the ego strategies is to say, everything is contributing to my awakening. I'll tell you, a time can come where you can see what a lie that is. The ego engaging in all kinds of ego perpetuating activities is not contributing to your awakening. And you can go on having things contribute to your awakening 100 million imaginary lifetimes from now. And I won't be there to check in with you, but if someone was there to check in with you, how's that half-hearted approach in which you don't dedicate your every moment of your life to awakening going? Because the illusion of the ego is going to be there 100 million imaginary lifetimes from now if one doesn't give one's entire heart, mind, and soul over to awakening. Well, entire heart, mind, and soul. All of one's time, all of one's every moment, all of one's heart, all of one's mind, all of one's soul. But you can do that. You can do that, but it does require, but the ego in most people doesn't want to do that, and one has to discover those tricks, be honest about them, and go beyond them. But you can do it. And you can bring the ego to its final end. You can dedicate your entire life to awakening. You can succeed. You can bring the ego to its final end and remain in the direct experience of infinite love, infinite happiness, infinite joy. You can do this. Anybody listening to this can do this. You can. It's only a question if you will. But you can.